Hey, Seven, welcome to day two of Private. How are you doing this evening?
I'm good, thanks, Derek. How are you?
I'm doing really, really well. I think I'm still kind of coming off a high after yesterday.
Yeah.
Went back and started listening to some of the talks that, I was backstage for virtually, just to make sure I was caught up on everything. Didn't get a chance to get through them all, but incredibly interesting insights and information coming out of yesterday. You had a chance to talk to Ed Snowden and Cindy Kahn, and I know you have a terrific conversation coming up, I'm sure, with Ken Liu tomorrow. What was your main takeaway after yesterday?
Main takeaway. Well, I was quite relieved to have got that particular session over with. And although at the time it was thrilling, and I didn't really get a chance to say, but Snowden's work was a big inspiration for my initial explorations of privacy before ORCID. I got a chance to chat to him briefly afterwards, which was a great pleasure. He was very personable and engaging, so I really enjoyed that also. I think the kind of question that I asked at the end really stuck with me, and especially his answer, of course, which was just sort of a kind of call to action from people in our industry and community of, just basically just take risks. Don't just try and stay safe. This is like, it's important to take risks and stay free. And I think that's a really important thing when we think about designing these systems, supporting them, building them, using them, is really thinking through like what we're doing, how we're architecting what, like, as a community, as a broader community in the whole decentralized space. We're architecting systems that will hopefully be used in the future to build a better kind of internet. So that was really the takeaway for me.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That was, I think, an incredibly important takeaway all over the community today was stay free. Not just stay safe, and of course, that generated additional discussion from people about like, what do you mean stay free? Where did that come from? So,
Right.
so that was really, really great. Good. Yeah, I really enjoyed actually listening to Harry Halpin and Vinay and people like that talk about what they're doing and the impacts that it's going to have hopefully in the near future. That was just great stuff all around. What about this evening? I mean, I'm really looking forward to Kara Swisher chatting with Audrey Tang later, and of course Rohan Gray and Peter van Valkenburg with Isabella Kaminska right after this. Are you looking for anything particular this evening, or are you just
But yeah, I've been absolutely inspired by Audrey's work in Taiwan, and the courage that it takes to do this kind of work, in the shadow of China, like right on the edge of it.
Mhm.
And Kara Swisher, obviously, also an incredible uh, person to be interviewing that, and her work. And I listened to one of her interviews with Snowden actually in last week. Also, Peter has been a big inspiration. I've done some work with him on digital cash and what it means to be private. The fact that we think of cash today as like the last sort of private currency, really, like the first private currency we can use, and other than the ones that we're now developing, things like Zcash, and maybe hearing from Zuko. Also, I think that I'm really interested to hear Cade speak. He was one of the early developers of Signal, and he's got a lot of really interesting philosophical and kind of very much like systems design kind of work as to how we think about all systems, decentralized systems, privacy, um, and yeah, kind of just another great evening. I think it was really fun. I've been prepping all day, as you mentioned, reading up on many of Ken Liu's works that I've read before. He's one of my favorite authors, and also listening to his talks recently, and looking forward to really engaging him on a bunch of subjects tomorrow evening.
Good, good. Yeah, I get to have a chance. Pardon me. I get to have a chat with Jay Freeman, better known as Soric in some circles, right after this coming session. Chad Soren Harper, our in-house designer, he's going to be on here later tonight
That'd be
for
great.
to kick off a special little auction with proceeds going to some nonprofits that obviously align with Orchid's values. So really looking forward to showing the community at large what those look like, and hopefully raising some money for those nonprofits. So that's going to be hopefully really interesting as well.
Yeah, Chad's the best. He's got some great work. Some of the work is right behind you, right there.
Yes, yes, this is done by Chad, and we've got some other great Zoom backgrounds as well. All right, well, I think this is a great time to pass things off to Isabella Kaminska, who is going to take us through the After Cash session.
Thanks, Derek.
Hello, everybody. I'm Isabella Kaminska. I'm the editor of FT Alphaville, and am going to be moderating this session on After Cash, Keeping Secrets in Permissionless Finance. I'm joined now by two eminent panelists. We've got Rohan Gray, who is an assistant professor at Willamette University College of Law, where his research focuses on the legal design and regulation of digital currency. He's also the president of the Modern Money Network, and has had some influence on the design of the new Stablecoin Tethering and Bank License Enforcement Act. Also joining me is Peter van Valkenburg, who is the Director of Research at Coin Center. So thank you both for coming in to discuss this important issue. Where should we start? I've been directed to sort of push you towards where you two agree rather than where you disagree. So I'm going to start off by asking very quickly, though, when it comes to the privacy issue and moving away from cash, what is, in your opinion, the biggest challenge that we are facing? Rohan, perhaps you would like to start this one.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing is that this is happening without the public being aware of the change. That in this situation, in this context, inertia is against us, because the inertia of the web and of digital systems at the moment is in favor of surveillance. And that without a significant change in how we understand things, and I credit Edward Snowden for doing more than almost any human being in our generation in raising that consciousness, without doing the same thing for money, we're not going to have a financial system that respects people's privacy at all. I'll leave it there for where
that sounds like that's a good opener. Peter, what do you think is the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I wrote a piece a little while ago called Secret Rights, or Your Secret Right to Cash. And it's because I think, there's no constitutional right here in the US. There's no clearly expressed right in the UK or in the EU to have cash available to you as a tool for commerce. And I don't think that's because we don't care about the fundamental aspects of having cash that relate to human dignity and human privacy. I think it's because we could never imagine a world without cash until somewhere around 1970 or 1980, when electronic transactions finally started, scaling and working through intermediaries. And at the time that happened, it was like, okay, cool, we can revolutionize the world and have better efficiency and better payment systems, and it'll be faster and cheaper. And so we can finally get rid of this thing called cash. But we don't realize that there's a fundamental trade-off there. If you lose cash, which is this generally private way to transact, because we can't have cameras that focus in on everybody when they take their wallets out of their pockets, then we're really moving into a world of full surveillance. And, in the US, we do have a right to, a warrant requirement if the government's going to obtain our private papers in a search and seizure. And that warrant requirement doesn't apply when you're doing transactions through a third party. And the Supreme Court case that established that precedent, that you have no warrant protections when you're giving your private financial information over to a third party, is California Banker Association versus Schultz. And it was the case that established the so-called third party doctrine, which has since been used repeatedly by the Supreme Court and by the US government to collect your emails, to collect your private internet data. So the Snowden revelations, and I agree with Rohan that Snowden's done more to raise the consciousness on this issue than anything else, were about electronic communications data, right? And how that was being hoovered up without a warrant. Well, that hoovering started in the banking context when cash was starting to be replaced by electronic transactions. And just to be brief, we're doing far more electronic transactions today than we were in 1970. So that trade-off has gotten profound, and it's all happened secretly. We've lost our right to cash, if you will, because we've sort of, without knowing it, given it up.
So I'm going to ask a provocative but obvious question, which is, what do you say to the people out there who basically favor convenience over privacy on the basis that they have nothing to hide?
I think Snowden has said people who think about the First Amendment in a certain way, you don't need people who think of the Fourth Amendment in that way, you have nothing to hide, so you don't need a privacy right, should think about the First Amendment. You have nothing to say, so you don't have a speech right. I mean, you know, we always have things to say and always have things to hide. It's not just that you're hiding. I think that the idea is that you're hiding illicit activity, but that's not the case. I'm just hiding completely innocent activity that is nobody's business. Privacy isn't about hiding, you know, your wrongdoing. It's simply about living a life with dignity where you can control to some extent the amount of information you make public about your personal activities. Contextual integrity is a term for that.
Rohan, what do you say to the idea that all this privacy in the cash world is simply a mechanism for encouraging criminal activity?
I think that's the same argument that people had about making, you know, the internet and V chips and things, is that it will allow child pornographers and all this kind of stuff. And the short answer is, if you really believe that, why don't you just put a chip in everyone's head? And then that way you'll catch everybody. If there's no concept of privacy where a law enforcement interest or catching the bad guys is ever not strong enough to overcome, then why bother having any privacy at all? And I think the answer is, we don't like that at all. We've seen what societies where that kind of privacy is lost looks like, and it's totalitarian fascism. And the people who say I've got nothing to hide, I think first of all, they're wrong. As Peter said, they do have things to hide. They just haven't thought about it. It must be nice to not worry about the kinds of parts of your personality or your identity that could eventually be used against you. But the second thing is that privacy is an ecological issue. It's like someone saying, hey, I don't care about global warming, so I can pollute. Well, if that means that everybody else on the planet gets screwed, you don't have that right. And when it comes to privacy, just to give a basic example, I send an email to somebody. If my email is surveilled, everybody I'm interacting with gets surveilled, whether they like it or not, whether they consent to it or not. And if you're the only person in Boston that hasn't given your social security number over, it's very easy for them to find you because you're just the other one. You're the one number left that isn't already given to everybody else. And so if you don't start from the presumption that privacy is a systemic phenomenon that has to be preserved at a level of civic responsibility, then the whole question devolves into your personal preferences. And I think that's a category error.
One other thing too that occurs to me is people always say, well, you know, if we have private electronic cash like Monero and Zcash, people are just going to go around doing crimes, and we will have no way to see it or track. Well, you know, not more than 40 years ago, 50 years ago, almost all transactions were taking place in a fully anonymous peer-to-peer fashion through cash and bearer instruments. And the 1950s, while certainly having all kinds of issues with systemic inequality and racism, was not a time of rampant crime. So I don't think, you know, this claim that the technology will enable crime because it will enable private peer-to-peer transactions is at all sensical if that was the norm throughout history, and that the exception is 1970 to now when we've had these fully surveilled transactions. So increasingly.
So given that I think we all agree that privacy is of paramount importance. And I suspect we would also agree that physical cash has some very unique properties in defending those rights that haven't yet been entirely replicated in electronic money, not least in crypto, because whereas there is privacy, there isn't absolute anonymity because the blockchain is so transparent, for example. So how do we reconcile that fact as we build digital systems? But also, Rohan, maybe for you, you're an advocate of the sort of more centralized approach to digital currency. And I have always struggled with this idea that a central bank can be both an issuer of electronic money and be able to maintain privacy without itself breaking the obligations that it charges all the other institutions to abide by in terms of KYC and AML. Wouldn't a central bank, if it is issuing digital currency, have like a duty to do KYC? In which case, can a central bank currency ever be private?
I mean, well, the first thing is I'd actually point to Jerry Bruto's, article about the idea that there is no inherent KYC requirement for bearer instruments or cash. This is a concept that comes out of bank accounts. And this is my own sort of personal hobby horse, but I don't use the term central bank digital currency when I can avoid it. I use the term digital public currency, because if you start from the idea of calling it central bank digital currency, it tells people this is an issue for central bankers. And if you ask central bankers what technology can achieve, they're going to say a better bank account. You ask a horse expert in 1850, they're going to say a faster horse, right? They're not looking at cars, they're using what they know. But at least in the US, right, it's the Treasury that issues coins and paper notes. Even the Federal Reserve notes, they get issued by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and then sent to the Fed. And I would say that's a starting point to have this discussion, is maybe we shouldn't be asking central bankers to provide a digital bearer instrument. We should be asking the actors that provide similar kinds of physical instruments for whom these questions are not a problem. And, there is a difference between issuing money and controlling every transaction. We know this because cash works like that today. The Treasury doesn't monitor every instrument that gets issued by the Treasury. It, in fact, is quite happy not to monitor those things. Central bankers, I think, have specific institutional pressures. First of all, that they like data because it helps them analyze macroeconomic trends. And secondly, they have, at least this current crop, an ideological commitment to macroeconomic stabilization through interest rate adjustment. But in a world of low interest rates, you come up against a cash barrier. And the only way through that is to get rid of cash. And so if you listen to someone like Ken Rogoff in his book, The Curse of Cash, half of it is punching down at blue collar criminals while ignoring all the white collar kind of crime. And, my view is if you really want to deal with financial crime, the easiest way to do that would be to stop respecting the property rights of anyone that doesn't declare funds over $1 million, let all the hackers loose, and then let's see who comes running to the state for protection, right? But putting that aside for a second, the alternative is that you have sort of a currency system where the central bankers aren't in charge of it all, and that's okay. And I think that, if the answer is that central bankers aren't the right sort of entity to lead this charge, that's probably a good thing.
But Rohan, and maybe Peter, you might have some insight on this. Is transferring the job of issuance to the Treasury actually solving the problem? Because if they, the classic sort of fear is that it's government overreach. The central bank is at least in theory an independent body, but if you push that responsibility to the government directly, isn't there even more of an incentive to potentially abuse those powers, even if it's not because it's mandated to collect KYC?
I mean, from a statutory law perspective, you might run into more of an issue with Treasury doing that, because Treasury is also obligated under the Bank Secrecy Act, which comes from Congress, to do the anti-money laundering policy setting through FinCEN. But that said, Treasury is labyrinthine, has several divisions. FinCEN and the Office of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes are one part with that obligation to form anti-money laundering policy. Congress could very easily sort of say, they do that, but there's this other branch that is there for the public good of creating private digital money, because it is a public good and because it's deeply American for there to be a bearer instrument currency that can go the world over and dominate. It's hegemonic, but it could be very good, certainly for the U.S. government, if they actually embraced private digital currencies, because we could see dollarization overseas. People would want to use this thing.
It would be a new sort of exorbitant privilege in that sense. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg has made the argument to favor his what used to be called the Libra system, that if certainly
I think it's Diehm now.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not sure.
I prefer to cling to the old. I don't really understand the logic, the name change, but but his argument was that certainly if we don't provide this public good of private and cheap, accessible money, then China will, but they won't maintain the privacy side of things. So is there really a race against the clock here, and how far ahead are the Chinese in pushing that sort of, or exploiting that inertia in the public domain with respect to privacy? Because if they have the first mover advantage and they, like with TikTok or whatever, everyone gets hooked on their system, is it too late?
I don't think you need to sort of position this in some sort of neo-Cold War framework, because as Snowden showed, the US had no problem violating people's privacy at a mass level. They didn't need China as a competitor on that front. They're quite happy to do it themselves. And so I think this is much of a homegrown surveillance state issue as it is a xenophobic one. And, one of the things about the Treasury, as Peter mentioned, is that it is got a lot of different interests in it. The problem with the central bank is that they have a singular set of goals and ideological commitment. If you're on the board, you share a huge amount in common with other people on the board. It's entirely possible that a privacy digital currency sort of bureau of the Treasury could be staffed with people that have completely different ideological goals than the FinCEN group. And that kind of distinction, it gets lost when you're looking at the US government versus China. This is as much a matter of different government interests, right? You have public defenders and public prosecutors. Outside of a few rare examples, they don't sort of eat lunch together. And a lot of people who may care about, the sort of harms and excesses of criminal enforcement might think that public defenders are doing really important work, even as they would love to, maybe reduce funding for DA offices. And so I think it's possible to have this conversation within the context of the US government and within the US culture. And it's just as important there, even if China didn't exist.
I think on the China question, I think they will absolutely lead out of the gate. It's much easier to get things done when you don't have democracy, when you have a single party state, and when you can, if the right people convinced, you can do whatever you want with your country. And it seems like they're motivated to do this now. I think partially motivated because they perceived a threat from Libra or Diem or whatever it is. And maybe now that threat seems to have somewhat passed, as they've somewhat neutered that protocol into something that's not much different than Facebook Pay, there'll be less motivation. But I still think we'll see a central bank digital currency from China before probably any other nation. That said, I don't think that means that they're going to sweep the world and we're all going to be using digital yuan. I have to credit Jerry Brito, who we've brought up before, the executive director of Coin Center, for writing this. People don't choose to use a currency because it's digital or not. In fact, all the history of digital currency has indicated that it's harder to use digital currencies because it upsets existing norms and things that people are comfortable with within their communities. And so that's why we haven't seen a massive uptick of, say, Bitcoin in regions of the world that actually have terrible monetary systems. It's because it's just too darn hard to use the thing. I don't think the Chinese UI, the user experience, will be so good that it'll change that fact. People choose currencies because of a faith in the monetary policy behind that currency, because of a faith in the power geopolitically of the country behind it, and frankly, because of a faith in the rule of law, that contracts denominated in that currency are more likely to be enforced. And China is certainly powerful, but its monetary policies are completely opaque and it has no rule of law. So why would you use a digital yuan unless you were forced to?
The other point here about central banks is that the US central banking framework, or the Anglo-US-UK central banking framework, is pretty hegemonic outside of China. If you look at the swap line network, if you look at where all the central bankers get educated before they go to run their own central banks, it's much more likely that whatever the US does is going to be the one that filters out across the rest of the world. And if you look at the BIS, the way they're talking about, right, they're sitting there having meetings with the former governor of Mexico's central bank and the US and the UK and the ECB. There is a block of hegemonic ideological interest in central bankers around the world. And I'm as much concerned about that happening without democratic participation as I am of the entire of China. I don't have any love for the Chinese government, but they got what, 1.3 billion, 1.4? How many of the central bankers around the world that all went to the same graduate program currently are making decisions about digital currency without a single legislator involved?
No, I have to say, I have to agree, and I hadn't considered the idea of the Treasury stepping in. I'm interested, actually, Rowan. What's been the feedback from the central bankers who have so obsessively pushed themselves into the CBDC space? I mean, because that is the talk of the town in central bank land. how, when you tell them maybe the Treasury should be doing it, not them, what's the response?
Well, first of all, they're usually not interested, because why would you be interested unless you have to be? And I'm not as much of an accelerationist as maybe some of my colleagues, but watching Donald Trump sort of mobilize the left of the US, and then watching Diem mobilize central bankers as maybe more of an accelerationist. So without some sort of credible threat, I'm not sure they're going to do anything. And maybe that requires a sort of populist elected leader to govern on this. And I'm very much looking forward to the outcome of the Ecuadorian election. My colleague Andres Arras knows a thing or two about digital currencies run by the government. I'd be curious to see if he wins that election, what happens there. But I think the short answer is central bankers believe they've basically monopolized the right to issue money. Most countries don't even talk about the Treasury having a parallel right, even if it is legally and historically true. Most central bankers consider this whole conversation one in which on day one, they genuflect to the law enforcement officials. In fact, it was just earlier today that Powell and Yellen both said, of course, anonymous currency is out of the question because it will be promoting money laundering. Well, what that says to me is they want to do what they want to do without the intelligence state beating down their door. So they make that Faustian bargain in the first minute. They concede everything you need, we'll give you. And then we see what's left for us. And that suggests to me that they're not going to be the leaders of anything good.
Okay, you're all very optimistic and coming up with constructive ways to help stop this horrific surveillance creep. But what do we do in a scenario where it's actually beyond our control? They roll this out and we wake up tomorrow and none of our transactions are private anymore. What then?
Well, first, I'd say we already live in that world. We live in a world where we do all of our transactions using money services businesses like Venmo or PayPal or big banks, and they're all subject to the Bank Secrecy Act in the US and its equivalents in every other nation that is a member of the Financial Action Task Force, which has basically exported US financial surveillance policy globally. So we already live in a relatively fully surveilled world. It's not quite as bad as China's DCEP, which will give the central bank complete visibility into even tiny transactions. They call it controllable anonymity, which is kind of like permissioned freedom. It's some sort of like wonderfully Orwellian term that they've come up with. But we already live in this world in the West, and that's a problem. So how do we change it is the question. And this might be where Rohan and I start to disagree or diverge. I would be happy to see a government take a step in that direction. If you could get, as Rohan said, a populist leader who felt that this was important and was willing to take on both the banks and the intelligence community who will hate this. That said, I'm more optimistic about private solutions. I'm more optimistic about, open source software and fully decentralized to the extent that that's possible solutions, things like Zcash and Monero, where you don't need to seek permission. I think government could adopt systems like Zcash, and the only thing they could change is the monetary creation function. So you'd have fully private transactions, even to the issuer of the units, but instead of miners creating new currency and creating the supply, you have that supply created by a central authority. You could bifurcate those roles in a cryptocurrency, and you could actually implement a crypto dollar. Is that likely to happen? No. But one thing I will say is, if we get some promise of privacy from government in the form of a central bank digital currency, because we have this populist change of heart, it needs to be done technologically. It can't be done through law. You can't simply have that branch of the Treasury swear that it won't look at transactions, because, to quote Anthony DiGiassi with a somewhat unfortunate metaphor, it's a chastity belt to which you hold the key. It is useless. They will break those promises of privacy. They will break their own laws. We saw this with the Snowden leaks and the PRISM program. So it's going to require the kind of technology that's already being developed in the private sector, and not even in the private sector, in the open source software community. And then the question is there ever going to be motivation to do that kind of thing in government? I'm skeptical.
So just before I go to Rohan on that, so is Bitcoin not going to be the answer anymore? And my other thought is, to what degree has the current crypto market already been captured by much of this sort of surveillance creep, in so much as it's all been regulated? Everyone, all the exchanges are subject to KYC, AML. How can you even operate now in the crypto space without being subjected to all? And from what I understand, the the regulation is now going to go beyond that and into sort of transactions from so-called privacy wallets as well. So if Coinbase or someone like that has the responsibility to capture all that data and be, you know, they can what's it called, enforced against, then are we, you know, is there any hope there?
So I think there is still hope. And just to be clear, right now, the world that we have with crypto is very much like the world of cash and bank money. We have Bitcoin held by Coinbase, which is equivalent to bank money, fully surveilled. And we have Bitcoin that's held by individuals on their smartphones or on a USB stick or things like that, which can be very surveilled using the blockchain, which is notoriously public. But that is effectively a bug that is in the process of being fixed. We have Taproot, we have the Lightning Network, we have multiple technologies being built on top of Bitcoin that will obfuscate that ledger and prevent the kind of centralized surveillance that it otherwise enables. And we have new cryptocurrencies like Zcash and Monero, which might simply replace Bitcoin if Bitcoin can't deliver on that longer-term promise of privacy. So that's the world we have right now. And you're absolutely right that we have to stave off the current proposed changes to anti-money laundering rules, both from the FinCEN rulemaking that's underway right now and from FATF's new draft guidance, which it released last week, which will be finalized next summer. Both have proposed significantly larger encroachments from we just ask for intermediaries to spy on their customers into we're going to actually ask for individuals to spy on other individuals. And we're going to solicit information about private citizens who've never handed their information voluntarily over to a third party. And frankly, those proposals are unconstitutional. And it'll be very interesting to see if we can get the Supreme Court, which has recently turned against the third party doctrine, I'll add, with Gorsuch and a few others, questioning its continued vitality, whether we can get them to rethink California Bankers Association versus Schultz and Smith versus Miller, which would be very exciting. We might lose, but it's the kind of thing that I salivate over as a constitutional law nerd.
Rohan, before you touch on those questions as well, I just wanted to also throw in one other query that I have, which is what happens if actually the future isn't about cash? What if cash is entirely removed from the table because we're all just, you know, shopping in Amazon, and Amazon is the be all and end all of all supply and demand? In that sort of Gosplan kind of private monopoly system, you know, I might not even need to venture out into the normal conventional fiat or crypto currency space because everything is just done on account.
Yeah, I mean, I think so I agree with Peter that you definitely need the tech layer, right? You need to not collect the data in the first place rather than collect it and hope that the person with the key to it all is going to look after things. But where I probably disagree is I think this needs to go beyond technical solutions. So, you know, colleagues of mine, mentors of mine who worked with the free software movement, open source movement for decades, they made a Faustian bargain early on with capitalism and with markets and with big businesses. And I think it's come back to bite them because when the time came, the profit motive always supersedes these other commitments. And so when you have actors for whom it's an easier path to cooperate with governments or to collect that data for commercial purposes, then any professed concerns about privacy go away. And without a theory of how you're funding this movement, without a theory of how you're getting people involved for more than just commercial self-interest, I'm not sure you build the political opposition to a totalitarian state necessary to prevent the fusion of commercial and political interests. But what that also suggests to me is that this concern for privacy goes beyond just using money. It goes to this nature of governmentality in general, whether it's getting welfare checks or getting a public job. You know, right now, people in the Biden White House are being fired from prior marijuana use because the assumption is that's relevant rather than who fucking cares? No, sorry, you know, excuse my language, but who cares what you do in your private life if it doesn't affect your business or your ability to do your work? So when it comes to the monetary layer, at least to me, first of all, public money is different from private monies, right? As Peter said, the currency we use to enforce contracts, the currency that the government uses, if we don't win that fight, I don't think a private monetary alternative will be enough. It will remain at the margins and then the bulk of the system will be surveilled. But that also suggests to me that cash won't be enough. We have to have privacy respecting features of systems where there may be intermediaries as well. And that is a much more messy question that we're going to have to deal with for a while. On the question for sort of the difference, I think, is also that Zcash and other instruments like that are built to try to decentralize the monetary layer as well as the payments layer. And I think that public money doesn't have that problem. We have a theory of how to issue public money. It's called the budget. It's called Congress. It's called the legislative process. It's a much different technical spec to try to build privacy respecting public cash than it is to sort of bootstrap a decentralized private currency where you have to have a theory of mining and everything else that actually changes the nature of the instruments. And so if the belief is that private for-profit actors will innovate their own technology and eventually it will move over to the public sector, at least in my view, that's a bad strategy. That's a losing strategy. That's going to leave us 10 or 15 years down the line with still no concerted coalition around public cash.
And what about this? If and when Amazon comes in and they're the intermediary and they don't even operate on a unit of account?
Well, then the question will be, are they so systemically important that they serve a public purpose? Amazon has limited liability as a corporate entity. We grant that as a public charter. If it's so systemically important that nobody in the country can operate without using it, we need to think of it like a public utility. And that's the kind of thing where you're going to lose maybe a lot of people for whom privacy sort of springs from the well of free market capitalism. I don't think it's true, and I don't think it's going to preserve the privacy of students in kindergarten with their learning profiles. If you don't start from a public goods, public infrastructure point of view, I think you're going to miss half of the most important fights, and that includes Amazon and other platform operators.
So I think we're coming up to time now, but Peter, last word for you.
I think where Rohan and I differ is just levels of optimism. This has been great. We've been fully in agreement about the importance of private digital cash. And I would prefer, as Rohan said, to see a world where there are private options like Bitcoin, Monero, and Zcash, which can be a currency of last resort for people in trouble. And much better would be to have that as well as a fully private digital dollar, because I think Rohan's right. Most people are going to continue to use dollars and give up their privacy in this sort of, it's not an Orwellian future, it's a Huxleyan future where you just sort of drink the soma and give away everything that is private and worth saving.
So there you go. Let's hope we come to some sort of consensus on. I think actually very rarely for us we do all agree. So perhaps there's hope still. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to pass it on.
Thanks so much, Isabella. A rare moment of agreement amongst people talking about privacy and decentralization and the level of it that we should want to achieve. Speaking of people who believe in decentralization, I have Jay Freeman, also known as Soric, an Orchid co-founder, the creator of Cedia. Actually, I think you pronounce it Cedia, I think I heard you say last week, and many other contributions to the open source ecosystem. Jay, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here.
Great. So we didn't get to hear a ton of the previous session, but obviously coming in at the end there, I haven't read Brave New World. I did watch the show, the Peacock original. I really enjoyed it. I imagine you've probably read Brave New World, right?
I think I might have. Honestly, I get a lot of those books mixed up between. There's even also a short story that I get mixed up in that same set.
Fair enough.
I can't remember the title of it. But
that's okay. That's fine. I kind of put you on the spot there. You didn't know I was going to ask that, so that's on me. I wanted to talk a little bit about your Twitter account. According to a recent tweet, somebody told you that you may have actually been successful running for California State Assembly rather than District County Supervisor, and I think it's Santa Barbara County. Is running for California State Assembly something you're interested in doing? Like how far do your political aspirations reach, just out of curiosity?
So honestly, the job hadn't looked that interesting when I was first analyzing it, because it involves spending 3 days out of every week in Sacramento and then frantically traveling back and forth in order to try to work with your constituents back in your home district. But it was only a year or so after that somebody had mentioned that I started to realize that a lot of the work that I end up doing is largely about policy relating to technology and trying to be able to have influence at that level. Now that said, so your question about do I have aspirations to go higher? Right now, to provide one more bit of context, I'm actually on a very small district. So I ran for 3rd District County Supervisor and lost. And then I'm on the board of the Isla Vista Community Services District, which is a very small special district. And that was like the right moment in my life to try to move into bigger politics. In 2016, Apple had really started to make it difficult in order to continue maintaining and working on the jailbreak ecosystem and working on Cydia. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And I started looking at politics as a potential option. But after that point, having gotten into instead working heavily on Orchid, and now having people trying to do all of this technology-focused intervention, it no longer honestly feels like the moment for my life to shift drastically. And I don't know if it will again. Maybe in another decade, maybe I would be interested in that. But as of right now, today, not really. Like, it's not going to happen like in 2 years or something, probably. So
Cool, fair enough. I mean, you're still relatively young. I think you're just a smidgen older than I am. So certainly, you have a lot of time, I think, to explore that if it's something that comes up. So good for you. Also on your Twitter account, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, you've pushed Apple really hard, speaking of Apple and jailbreaking, regarding their security research practices. And despite being an Apple user myself, I would say in a lot of cases, yeah, rightfully so. Google used to be fairly lax on this front, but obviously has taken it, especially Android security, far more seriously over the past few years. I know the bug bounties are much, much bigger than they have ever been. They have Project Zero as well, which looks for vulnerabilities all over the place. What security practices would you like to see Apple change?
I think the biggest thing is that when Apple, like what Apple security practices, you also have to ask for each individual thing that they do, for whom is this security? And in a lot of cases, Apple's security features are actually securing the device against you. They're designed in order to protect Apple's interests or the interests of a third-party developer. They're there in order to hide the execution of code and prevent you from being able to get access to the running state of some piece of software that's on your device. It's essentially being able to help DRM. And so I guess the biggest issue that I have with Apple's whole security mantra is that they're securing the device for the wrong person. They should be targeting security for the user. And if you care a lot about things like privacy, having the device not necessarily always acting in your best interests is one of the worst things you can imagine.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely fair. Has that influenced at all the work, like the reason you decided to help co-found Orchid and the work you're doing right now?
Absolutely, in various ways. I mean, one aspect of the work on Orchid is that VPNs are actually restricted by Apple to require a special API entitlement. And so we actually cannot deploy VPNs through the normal App Store environment into countries that Apple has restricted, and even provide the software open source and have developers in those areas make it easy for users to install it themselves. So we end up spending a lot of our efforts trying to deal with the fact that Apple has this weird version of security for somebody different than the user.
Fair enough. Okay, well, that's our time. Jay, thanks so much for making time this afternoon out in California to spend some time with us here on Private. I'm going to pass things off. We're about to get into the Privacy and the Pandemic panel, Solutions Against Surveillance, starting off with a chat with Jen Zhu Scott. Jen, you don't have any slides or anything? I think we're just going to take it all in, that your words wash over us. So please take it away.
Thank you so much, Derek. I always find slides become distraction when we talk about something as personal as privacy. It's quite important to share some personal stories. So let me start with my personal stories. I was born and brought up in mainland China in the days when nobody owned anything. And everybody had a job, but everybody was poor. And of course, now we look at that kind of system, we think that's completely impossible to accept. And yet, in our digital society, if we look at how transformative technology has become for our society, this is the exact kind of economic model we're living with in terms of how we own our data. If you think about in the world right now, 80% of the data floating around the world is really created by individuals. And yet the data, majority of the data really controlled by literally 4 companies in the US and 2 companies in China. And how is that system in terms of, if we look at the economic value created by this enormous amount of data, we all have contributed. And yet the economic value really being centralized and realized by those handful companies. And we think the model, the economic model, a socialism model I grew up with in mainland China was not acceptable. And yet today, everybody was very happy to keep contributing the data because somehow there is some sort of service you've been provided. Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, described very well that if you are not the customer, and you're not even the product, you're just the raw material. And worse, in our society now, for companies like Facebook, especially for youth, I have 2 young girls, and I often think about this, while they are producing and being milked by companies like Facebook to produce, supply this raw material, this data, very, very, very valuable for companies like Facebook. They're not only just giving away their privacy, they're giving away their mental well-being. And also we've watched with all the democracies around the world, we're giving away the well-being of the societies as well. So I realize, it's one thing that if we only talk about how do you provide your privacy from cybersecurity point of view, from philosophical point of view, I also think what's going to really hit home is for people to realize there is economic value of your data. And the reason I think this is very, very important, if we look at in the West, most of this kind of reaction from the with big tech and what's going wrong, what went wrong with big tech, the reaction usually is very top down. It's from regulators, from antitrust, or from regulatory point of view to, having senators who don't understand technology question the founders of big tech, and then debate for 6-8 months and come up with some policy. And guess what? It's executed by big tech. And by the time the technology has run away. And but what's really fascinating is happening in India and China. Now, neither of the country is perfect, but India started to do India Stack. We're basically providing this kind of person-based data management system that's completely from bottom up, that individual will be able to manage your data in your data wallet. In China, of course, everybody's paying attention in terms of digital RMB. And I think the media mostly focus on how digital RMB is going to displace US dollars, or how digital RMB is going to provide even more surveillance for the government. However, there's a big piece actually really missed. I think the media, obviously in the West, has completely missed is, I think in March last year, the chief researcher of PBOC's Digital Currency Institute wrote an essay. And of course, March last year, everybody was focused on COVID. So the essay was completely missed by the media. And in the essay, he talks about, of course, using digital RMB, you will be able to capture all the great economy. The GDP calculation will be much more accurate. There will be feedback loop for monetary policy. But the essence of digital RMB is really to build this relationship connection between individuals' economic value of individuals' data to the monetary system. And when I read that, I thought, whoa, this is very futuristic. But even for me, coming from China, sometimes I forget comments making from that level was never a mistake or so very, very soon after that, State Council issued another policy paper, described there are 5 means of key production for China's economy: is land, labor, capital, technology, and data. So in China, that data has already been regarded by the government as one of the 5 key means of production. So it comes back to what we are doing now. Global pandemic, of course, is a horrible event for majority of people in this world. And right now, we know that, for in the US, so 2 years ago, a bunch of entrepreneurs and technologists and policymakers truly believed that individuals should own their data, came together, started the governance level that it's a nonprofit, and there's no shareholder, no venture capitalist to pressure us to sell the data, and build this Android version of Apple Health to allow individual to have this interoperability between hundreds of different healthcare providers in the US. When COVID happened, it became very clear to us that the reason why the borders have to shut down is because between countries, there's no interoperability with COVID-related health data. So we started to create Commonpass. Commonpass essentially is a data wallet for individual to carry your COVID-related testing and vaccine data. If you want to show someone, that's in your secured data wallet. None of the PII will go to any cloud. It's on your phone. We treat every phone as a microserver. And the result is that because we are nonprofit and we're Swiss Trust, and we are not one of the big tech, and we're not, we don't belong to any country. We don't have any shareholder. And our momentum in the past few months have been astonishing. I'm sure many of you have already read in all the media been covering Commonpass and the Commons Project, etc. So right now we're having conversation with more than 30 governments in the world. Most of them are in minister or prime minister level, and we are working on some of the travel bubbles and have this kind of direct confrontation in terms of how can we protect individuals' data while you create this safe people's movement during the global pandemic, and to be able to provide this COVID-related health data interoperability. And our goal and dream is that global pandemic has been horrible, but what if the legacy we could have after this global pandemic is in fact that because of the urgency of international travel, and we need to create this kind of digital infrastructure, after global pandemic, actually it's a start of individual will be able to control and keep and own their health data in their personal data wallet. So that is our goal. And right now, we working quite closely with the large institutions. We're not purist. We understand to exist in this world provide solution that accepted by many, you have to have collaboration with many different organizations. And I look forward to discussing this with the rest of our panels and hearing questions from our audience. And we'd love to get all your support. And Derek, thank you very much for having me, and back to you.
Thanks so much, Jen. That sounds really interesting. Worked with a team before working on technology that could have done something similar. They're headed in a different direction right now, but still really interested in this idea of owning my data, sharing it when I want to, with whom I want to, ideally being able to revoke access at some point. So hopefully you and your team are heading in that direction as well. Great. And I heard some hope in there for my friends in India of hopefully getting away from Aadhaar and going to something a little more bottom up, as you mentioned. Great. Next, we have Micha Benoliel. Over to you, Micha.
Yes, thank you, Derek. I think I have an issue with my clicker. So I don't know if I will be able to pass the slides.
Okay, we got your slides up screen. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, it just doesn't want to accept my code. Okay.
All right. The AV team is going to take care of it for you. Just let us know when we need to move forward.
Okay, I'm happy to go now. Yes. Well, hi everyone. My name is Micha Benoliel. I'm a co-founder of a company called Nodal, where we built a network for IoT devices, and more recently, we also, with my team, launched a foundation called the Coalition Network, and we're gonna share with you now some of the findings of the last year during this pandemic, which can be very interesting in how to build actually private social networks. So I'm here to talk about why contact tracing apps actually may have paved the way for a new generation of private social graph and networks. My team and I started very early, almost 10 years ago now, to work on what we call the new internet, meaning that anyone that has a smartphone we thought could be part of this giant network and participate also for moving information. So if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in this slide, we show basically how with your smartphones, we can use a technology that we called in the past peer-to-peer mesh, move information even when you are not connected to the internet by moving data from your phone to someone else who is next to you and also has the same mobile application as you do. And the first use case we found for this technology is actually a messaging app. If you can go to the next slide, it's called Firechat. And we launched that messaging app for a famous festival, which is the Festival of Burning Man in the middle of desert of Nevada. And people back in time didn't have any connection, so they could use this app, Firechat, to communicate. And what happened after that was pretty amazing. If you can go to the next slide. This app started to be used actually by, and click one more time, just so we can show so this app was being used by students in Hong Kong, for example, to organize their pro-democracy movement that was back in the fall of 2014. And we had actually 500,000 students downloading the app in Hong Kong and basically using that app to communicate because they were afraid that China would actually stop the access and cut the access to the internet. On the next slide, you can see that's me. I was actually on a layover in Hong Kong and decided to stay when all this happened because it was kind of unusual and unexpected and actually amazing demonstration of also how this technology can help people in this context. We got, if you can go to the next slide, we got a lot of actually publicity at that time. That's the app mentioned by John Oliver on his show. And after that, if you go to the next slide, so the app started to be used during more common events like music festivals where you don't have cellular access very often because you have too many people, or also, if you go to the next slide, during a disaster recovery situation like the flood in Chennai in India back in 2015. So what my team and I realized, if you can go to the next slide, is that we could actually leverage what we call the smartphone infrastructure to connect to almost to anything. And it's really what we call a citizen network, and everyone with their smartphone can actually participate to connect to appliances and sensors. And that's why we created this company called Nodal, where we built a giant network for connecting things to the internet. And everyone, if you go to the next slide, is actually incentivized to participate through a new proof of work that we call proof of connectivity. And as you move data from your phone, you actually get paid and you generate the cryptocurrency. What happened last year, so if you back in March last year, we were all in the office, had to leave the office because of the pandemic. Yeah, next slide is good. And we realized what Singapore was doing with contact tracing, and we really felt almost that we had to do something and use our knowledge to build a contact tracing protocol or exposure notification protocol to actually protect people's privacy. So we worked, the whole team during a month, night and day, and with the open source community, we released a protocol which is called the Whisper Tracing Protocol that actually was built to protect people's privacy in the context of contact tracing. If you go to the next slide, so the way contact tracing works, or exposure notification, how it is also called today, is that your phone will record your interactions with people who are around you and you spend time with. And in the event someone gets infected, basically they can declare it on the app. And if you have spent time with that person and you might be at risk, then your phone automatically will notify you. So this, go to the next slide. So this is made possible to this protocol that we call the Whisper Tracing. We are now in the third evolution of that protocol, which is even better for protecting privacy and brings also more features. And if you go to the next slide, so this technology is pretty useful because you can actually determine if you spend time with someone and you don't need to have actually information like the GPS on your phone always on. So today we are able to know if that distance with someone, or the time you spend with someone was actually less than a meter or more. If you go to the next slide, so the way it works is you basically have interactions that get recorded by the phones when they are in proximity. And if you can go to the next slide, and when someone is declared infected, in that case, they share in the cloud their interaction token, which is encrypted and anonymous. And only the people who were able to generate that interaction token together with you and they were in proximity with you will be able to retrieve that information and then alert you if, for example, I shared an information that I was tested positive to COVID, or in the future, it could be actually any other kind of virus. If you can go to the next slide. So what we discovered with the team is that this technology could have actually much more application outside of the context of exposure notification and contact tracing, and we think it's actually pretty interesting. So if you go to the next slide, you can see that if we use the private social graph, because it stays on the phone of the person, is leveraged, you could potentially even improve the contact tracing application or exposure notification application. So your phone would be able to notify you if you meet someone who can be a very good friend, for example, or a group of friends, and for some reason, the phone of your friends know that they have spent time with more people than they usually do, or they changed their habits, so they might be more exposed to the virus. And your phone could actually resurface that information to you and tell you, oh, be careful. You may be more at risk because you are meeting people who have met actually a pretty large number of people in the last 2 days. Another way this kind of private social graph can be leveraged is also in the context of ride sharing. You could be alerted if someone prior to you took a cab, the same ride sharing car that you did, and actually was declared positive, tested positive. Then you could also be alerted. That's how you can leverage this kind of private social graph. And we believe that the potential is actually gigantic, and it could redefine the way of building social networks with much more privacy. So if you go to the next slide, this can be applied in the context, for example, of professional events, or in the context of you commuting or meeting with your friends. And in the event you and a few other people share the same interest, and you decide to actually have information on who are these people, and several people in the same social graph decide to surface and make that information available, then you could be notified that basically you share the same interest and someone you spend time at an event with, or that's someone that you just randomly met, or you met on a regular basis during your commute, or you are close to during your commute, for example. So we really believe that these technologies can redefine the way of building social networks. And we hope that our findings can be used by many people in the community and app developers. Actually, everything is open sourced. You can find that on the coalitionnetwork.org website. And if you want to reach out, here is my email. You can also follow me on my Twitter. And you can also, if you are interested in the topics of wireless, privacy, and the cryptocurrencies, we are holding a clubhouse, which is the Wireless Club, and we will welcome you anytime when we have this club running. So thank you very much for your time. I'm super excited to share with other panelists, and thank you again, Derek.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Micha. I've heard of Firechat before. I haven't had to use it, thankfully. Certainly not for the reasons that that the protesters in Hong Kong needed to. But regardless, amazing technology. One of the developers here at Orchid actually helped develop, Greg Hazel. I just found that out behind the scenes here. So obviously we share something in common, and we have an incredibly bright person who helped build Firechat, now helping build Orchid. I should have mentioned off the top, Jen Zhu Scott is with the Commons Project Foundation. Micha did a very good job of promoting the fact that he is with Nodal now. And next up we will hear from Cade Diehm from the New Design Congress. Cade? Thanks, Derek. Take it away.
And it's wonderful to hear from Jen and Micha as well. This little talk today is about privacy and resilience in unexpected places. Before we get started on that, I would like to just quickly describe what the New Design Congress is. So after a large career in the last 8 years, working from everything from prototyping Signal with open whisper systems through to early blockchain and Bitcoin startups and digital security. In 2020, after a very successful talk at DevCon, the Ethereum Foundation conference, I started the New Design Congress, which is an independent nonprofit research organization fiscally sponsored by Simply Secure, a US-based nonprofit that sees all infrastructure as power and technologies as social accelerants. We understand the relationships between technologies and societies, and we use that to inform strategic and policy product directions and things like that. The New Design Congress itself really deals in 4 key areas. We look at security from the background of myself and our other people who work there. We look at digital identity and all of its forms, including first principles of digital identity. We look at interfaces and architecture and infrastructure. And we look at economics. And it's from here we're trying to provoke new ways of looking at things. And what I'd like to try to do today is try to unfairly to ourselves summarize as much of our work as possible within the context of today's topic. Really, we're looking at, in 2021 and beyond, 3 core areas, and I'm hoping that I can spend the next 8.5 minutes discussing digital identity, network connectivity, and systems design from the observations that we've learned in the last year. So the first thing I want to talk about is a talk that I gave back in 2018 called Protocols and Governance. And this was a very surface level dive into the world of network design and how it influences network politics. We looked at 3 separate types of topographies for networks: peer-to-peer, federated systems, and blockchains, each of which favor certain kinds of political structures. So peer-to-peer networks favor social governance outside the protocol. Federation favors what kind of constitutional monarchy, for lack of a better term. And blockchains are a little bit more near feudal, where power is centralized in the code base through its need for enforcement and verification and trust. At the same time, we started looking at design and equipment and hardware, and we started mapping friction between human and infrastructure systems. And this could be very simple. For example, the global phenomenon of Minecraft users who go from being simple gamers to network administrators as they start to administer their own systems. Or it could be more concrete than that, such as the difficulties amongst the popularity of virtual reality systems. In all cases, I think the most striking example might be the person trying to connect a Bluetooth speaker on their car as they hurtle down a highway. What we started to realize was that the aspiration of frictionless design in all protocols and interfaces may actually be based on a myth. And it might be that users actually will trade friction for the kinds of things that they want to do. At the same time, when we start to design at scale, we start to come across a concept called weaponized design. Now, weaponized design is an interface or a system that empowers harm through trade-offs, oversight, or apathy. And this is really, really a huge problem, I think, in designed systems, whether it's, again, an interface or a protocol, in which the system has to scale to cover as many people as possible from a single group or small group of people. In a simple example of, there's many of these, but a simple example might be the Facebook year in review, in which the algorithms choose a photo that seems like it had a lot of engagement, but in fact is quite traumatic. Here we have, for examples, the death of a child, the death of a beloved pet, a person's ashes, and a burning house being juxtaposed against celebratory imagery, thereby traumatizing the users that experience it again. But as we start to really try to reckon with that, we come up with this concept of design ethics. And design ethics, I think, also, when you apply scale to it, also is quite difficult to see how that might work and might begin to see real systemic change. So in this video from 2011, a Black retail worker shows that the early facial recognition technology doesn't see his face, but sees the face of his white colleagues. And indeed, these systems that started in the first part of the decade were kind of trained on material we might consider racist in terms of not being able to see non-white faces. And instead of really digging into the root causes of this technology, what you end up with is 2 outcomes. By addressing the symptom and not addressing the root political causes, you end up with biometrics and facial recognition everywhere. These 2 examples are, of course, the Amazon Go store on the right, or the biometric distribution for food aid in Jordan for Syrian refugees. But it has another much more, biometrics also enabled the state, an authoritarian state, to start to track protesters. And of course, the real outcome here is that while we were arguing over the ethics of biometric and facial recognition technology, it turned out that these technologies themselves were revealing themselves to be authoritarian. And the only thing left for the protesters to do was to tear them from the earth. In that way, we've really failed in that aspect. This work, of course, is also followed up in an essay called This Is Fine, where I apply these kinds of theories and thinking to decentralized networks. I want to talk just briefly about some of the work that we're doing in 2021 in the last 3 minutes and 45 seconds, about how we're finding privacy and resilience in unexpected places, specifically around economic empowerment and privacy within smaller groups, and not instead of embracing scale, trying to find the localized versions of these. So of course, this is based on a definition of privacy that starts at the conclusion of the financial crisis, or the beginning of the financial crisis, and the conclusion 10 years later of the companies that arose from the financial crisis. You're atomizing gig economy services that really rely on surveillance in order to maintain their control and their dominant position in the marketplaces, but also the wider range and how that actually plays out. So the two examples I want to give is, one is a report from some friends of mine's at Component, which kind of looks at how you can build resilience through the economic systems of music, which seems like it's a difficult thing to do in 2020, 2021, but actually can be proven as quite lucrative in certain contexts, especially geographically, when you measure it through Bandcamp. And indeed, one of the most interesting things that they have is this International Generosity Index that shows how as connections are made between people on a micro level, the generosity index extends, and people actually, the value starts to be drawn simply from the interactions with each other, from the very bare bones platform, rather than an over-engineered platform that's designed to scale infinitely. But the real thing I'm really interested in is the real unexpected places, and how we can tie privacy and this kind of economic support together into something that might begin to show us some interesting ideas. So the furry community, of course, is a subculture that's global. It deals with people who identify in a pop culture sense or in an identity sense with anthropomorphic animals. And this global subculture is on the rise around the world. These are the top conventions, and they're all experiencing exponential growth. And despite the fact that most congoing, that is, people who participate in these in this subculture more than just being online, despite the fact that these people exist within a very middle-class structure, they in fact tend to spend within their subcultures quite a lot of money. And indeed, some people actually commission large amounts of artwork or support people far beyond the traditional patronages of economic, of visual or music and creative arts. And indeed, much of the top Patreon accounts, for example, are also based on, also furry. And this is interesting because I think this comes from the makeup of the furry community, of course. There's a high degree of disability and a broader representation of sexuality here, and a high degree of self-esteem that's experienced when people join the community. And so I think in the last 50 seconds, rather than go through my series of statements that I will make, I'll end on this here, which is I think that when we move scale away and we start to look at different examples, this was one of many, we start to look at different examples of what economic solidarity and privacy might look like when we stop looking at devices and start looking at people from a socio-technical perspective, is that by taking besiegement from the external society, the attacks from the outside, or the atomization, combining it with the abundance of tech labor and inclusive spaces, what you end up with are three things: community-led infrastructure sovereignty. When you combine besiegement and inclusive spaces, you get intergenerational solidarity. And when you combine abundance of tech labor with inclusive spaces, you get these marketplace developments. And of course, I think this is most seen when you then bring scale into it in something like Discord, which is now valued at $10 billion and is in talks with Microsoft to be bought. I think the three things, if we were to think about digital identity, network connectivity, and systems design, there's really three things that we're interested in with New Design Congress going forth. That's a privacy as a practice, Digital identity is dangerous. All forms of connectivity is technical debt. And privacy and resilience, I don't think, are built at scale. And what I'm interested in as we move forward is not to think of things in terms of frictionless design, both in protocols and interfaces, but instead to see things as microeconomic and social networks that we can then build from in the future. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Cade. I was probably shouldn't be, but I was just over in Telegram saying like Cade is blowing my mind. Some people in there were chatting. I remember, I know some friends who have gone through the your year in review trauma, specifically the loss of a child. So yeah, you gotta be careful. So it's not about me, though. I'm going to pass this off to Ryan Selkis, who's going to actually moderate this panel. Ryan, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll pass the baton over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me. Excited to follow up on those great presentations that we just saw. The prompt for this session is a little bit open-ended, but basically we're trying to figure out, everybody talks about COVID as an accelerant for technology, and there are a few trends that seem to be at odds that we're going to tackle in this particular session. One in which we're struggling with how do we actually enforce privacy and personal data rights in a Web3 future, and then the other where there's this notion of certain security sacrifices that we need to make in the interest of the common good. And we saw this 20 years ago with the Patriot Act. We've seen it time and time again. Whenever there's a crisis, it tends to be difficult to safeguard some things that we'd previously taken for granted. And the three conversations that I think we just saw aim for a balance there. So I want to go to one of Cade's punchlines at the very end as jumping off point. Cade, you said digital identity is dangerous. And I want to kind of hear from all three of you, unpack that statement a little bit more as a jumping off point, specifically how it impacts your projects, your organizations, and what the 30-second answer is for how we can build better digital identity that is not dangerous in interconnected and fully online future.
Did you want me to start?
Yeah,
Okay.
you'll take it away because you ended there. So why don't you kick off the next phase
that's
of the
why I asked.
conversation?
Yep.
Yeah.
So the 30-second answer is that I think that digital identity in its current form is based on a particular configuration that started through a series of early computing experiments and paradigms and has largely been unchallenged as a result of that, which is, for lack of a better term, is a design of convenience. And it's now used in a lot of the research that we do around security. We're talking with defense lawyers who talk about how digital identity through web browsing is built from web browsing, for example, to help build cases against people, or just large amounts of presence on the internet being converted into a form of digital identity as like a very raw example. But in all forms, there's a kind of rationalist component to it. This is the Cartesian idea of I think, therefore I am, which defines digital identity. And I think that what we're really looking at is like, what could we do if we brought in the cultural idea of identity, where you are seen as not just your own performative curation through security or authentication or things like that, but rather from how other people see you as well in a more social way.
And Jen, I guess tactically speaking, you're in the weeds with Common Health, Commonpass, trying to basically solve this problem of finding a balance amidst the pandemic and getting people back to normal in some way, shape, or form through these digital health passports. What are some of the balances that you're aiming to strike now, not just for solutions to COVID, but potentially, precedent that you're setting for health passports in general, and how to maintain, international privacy across different jurisdictions when it comes to healthcare rights?
Thank you so much, Ryan. First of all, I don't think a health passport is the right way to look at this kind of solution, right? It's what we're creating is really a data wallet And it's specifically in this case is your health data wallet. I kind of agree with Cade that the digital identity, if you're not careful, it's really dangerous, right? And it's not, the way we look at it, it's not only just a technological nature of this kind of solution, but also governance nature of this solution. If we have, if we look around, you know, our entire world has been completely transformed by technology, and it's so pervasive to every aspect of our life. And yet, when we think about technology, especially a solution handing to our hands, most of them, the most popular ones, are really produced by and offered by 5-6 companies around the world. And how is that going to provide? It doesn't matter how their intention is, or you know their technology is advanced. If their business model is built in to really monetize the most valuable part of this whole process, which is your data, we would never get there in terms of protecting individuals. So you have to address from not only technology point of view, but also from governance point of view. And certain type of you know, technology need to be regarded as public goods and public digital infrastructure. And with this kind of digital infrastructure should not be built by any of the private for-profit technology companies. Secondly, I also think it's very important when we talk about digital identity. What is your identity, right? This is a, you know, old question we always ask ourselves. Is it your ID when you travel? That's your identity. Is your online presence? That's your identity. Or is it your DNA, right? What do you want to keep in your wallet that can confirm that's you? And I think in the old world, it's very much depends on what's on your passport. That's really your ID. But increasingly, as you know, solution Cade is creating, and as you know, DNA genome technology starts to advance, I think I can foresee at some point in the very near future, we need to really, you know, have this kind of infrastructure can safeguard the very genetic, you know, footprint of of ourselves as being to be able to control and manage that kind of data, right? And my dream is that after a global pandemic, we actually have this kind of digital wallet, be able to, you can manage this kind of sensitive data in your wallet and control and own it.
Micha, digital identity is dangerous according to Jen and Cade. How is it not dangerous, right? Because I think we've all been in situations where we just want to use our thumbprint, we just want to use our passcode and basically open up, you know, basically unlimited access with respect to our own personal, you know, identifying information for certain use cases and kind of single instances just for convenience. But obviously there are security pitfalls. So that's, you know, how do we balance this? How do we make this an asset? And how are you thinking about building the infrastructure to have your cake and eat it too?
So I think what Kate mentioned is that basically what defines your identity is also your social basically interactions, especially when you are in the digital world and online. And to come to what Jen said, when you touch into very private information like health, then obviously the topic of identity becomes super important. I actually think that today we have the technologies to improve the state of things. You have the cryptography and different techniques of cryptography and decentralized network and more commonly used. So you have ways today, especially in the case of a health passport, for example, where you actually a user would never need to actually disclose their identity or the proof of you having been tested positive or negative, or you having had a vaccine is something that can be stored, like Jen mentioned, on your phone, and you don't need to have any other trace or record of that anywhere else, except maybe on the decentralized infrastructure where you are the only one who can read that information, or you can actually decide if you want to let someone else access and read that information. But your identity or name doesn't even need to be there stored in the cloud somewhere. So I think we actually have these trustless technologies today that are mature and can be more and more used commonly. And that's why it requires also a lot of education among the different industries who actually have to deal with people's identity and management of people's identity. And I think we have the tools. So it's just a question of educating people, telling them how these tools can be used, where they can be found. And also people have to claim more and more that they want actually their information to stay private. And often because of convenience, unfortunately, that's when people actually make compromise very often and too often basically with privacy.
I wonder how much of the convenience element is just that everybody's used to using the same 5 or 6 companies, to Jen's point. And it's tough to break that monopoly or oligopoly and still have convenience when you're navigating around the web. The issue with open systems that I think many people have commented on with decentralized identity in particular, it reminds me of that cartoon. There's 12 competing standards. We need a unifying, one size fits all standard for X, right? And then the second cartoon, there are now 13 open competing standards, right? So we've seen this in messaging. We've seen this in a ton of different technologies where the Googles, the Facebooks of the world, as much as we all despise in some cases how they are using personal identifying information, they do have this gravity to them that seems like it's going to be very difficult to replicate with open systems. So how do you all as teams think about building the open source tooling so that there is greater interoperability for these identity systems, and we can strike that balance so it's not just incumbent on us trusting the big 5 or 6 technology giants?
I actually think.
Go ahead, Jen.
Go ahead. No, you went last time. Micha, go ahead, and then we'll go. It'll be a snake draft here. So Jen will go next, and then Cade back again.
Okay, so yeah, I won't be long. I just want to add that, I mean, even if the tools are here, the reason why these big companies take advantage of the information they can gather about people is because they make money out of it. And I think as long as we don't shift the economic models, and as long as basically most of the money is coming from the information taken about people, and we market people's information, then things are not going to shift. But thankfully, I think what we see now is the big movement of decentralized architecture and blockchain. I think we're going to see the birth of new economic models that are going to prove that actually there's no reason why to collect that much information about people. And I think we're going to see a lot of new companies emerge with new economic model that makes sense and are able to generate a lot of revenues. And I would say that to finish that, yeah, I think that you need to have an economic, something that makes sense economically for that. And the reason why these companies are so powerful is because they make so much money about actually transacting your personal information.
Jen?
Yeah, I think the economic power is very important. I also want to emphasize this kind of a bottom-up approach. Right now we feel, especially I feel in the West, is very much top-down from the regulators, from the government comes some sort of reaction. But end of the day, for all of us, we have this opportunity to, if we can put some solution, alternative solution into people's hands and they like using it, that's the most powerful statement we can ever make, right? A good example is when WhatsApp start to change the terms, and people look around to try to have this this exodus from WhatsApp, and most of people choose Signal functionality. Actually, I don't think Signal's functionality is that great, but we use Signal because Signal has this governance model, not only just from technology point of view, it has this governance model, does not need to make money from your privacy. And therefore it's trusted, right? So I actually think right now, we think all the 5, 6 players, it seems so powerful. And remember, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of people never heard of Google, and Google was so new, right? And how did Google become so indispensable in such a short period of time? And who are we here to say that one of those solutions would not become indispensable in 15, 20 years time? I gave a TED talk about why you should get paid for your data in end of 2019. And I started talking about the economic value of individual data is specifically, I want to inspire the kind of bottom-up consumer upgrade, where they demand, if you are making a lot of money from my data, where is my share, right? How we created this model, we can share this economic value. And to my surprise, after the TED Talk, I received hundreds of emails, people approaching me, telling me those little solutions they're creating, this little app they're creating. And I got so encouraged. If you look around today, we're having this conference specifically talking about privacy. So I think this kind of bottom-up movement has already started. And the question is what we can do to really empower that, to accelerate that. So people will have this kind of practical solution in their hands, replacing solution provided by 5-6 large tech companies sooner.
One thing, Cade, maybe you can touch on here, and just to the root of my question, right? Yes, could there be disruptors and disruptive companies or disruptive networks to the big data, conglomerates, of course. I guess the root of my question though was, how do we make it so that you can truly lock in a wallet your personal information, and it will work between all these decentralized networks? And we aren't basically creating competitive standards at the very lowest layers in these networks for portable, secure digital identity. Because to me, that's the only way that you can, you basically need like foundational primitives that people can build on top of and become ubiquitous, versus having 20 different competing standards, when I could just use Facebook Connect, or I could just use my Google sign-in, right? That to me, I think is the core of the issue. So we're not competing at that very lowest layer. Otherwise, it's going to be a pretty significant uphill battle.
Yeah, so I think we need to rethink the first principles of identity. And I think that we need to go right back to the start and really evaluate collectively what we're capable of with digital identity. In terms of some of the challenges that I think play a major role in what you're saying here, Ryan, is digital identity today suffers from two serious issues. Jen is, of course, right to say that it should be determined by the individual. The idea that individual control over identity is paramount is absolutely, we're in agreement with that. There is, however, two problems. And of course, sorry, to mention as well, what Micha said as well around decentralization, absolutely true as well. There are two challenges with one for each of these points that I think, again, this is part of what we've done so far. And also, I think something that needs to be collectively solved for. One is the issue of the limits of consent in digital systems. So I may have a consent agreement with a provider, be it a medical practitioner or a social media network or some kind of authentication service. But of course, that consent model only exists between myself and that individual, and it doesn't take into account all of the other actors that observe that or somehow see at the very minimum or are participating in that system of consent, be it the people who control and administer infrastructure on the behalf of the provider, be it those who can analyze and otherwise observe and build machine learning algorithms, feed machine learning algorithms from that participation, and so forth. So the current models for consent that we have do not account for the scale that we're asking people to consent into. So we have to solve for that. On the other hand, a decentralized identity system has a serious issue with decentralizing risk. One of the big things that centralized systems offer is protection from litigation and protection from cybersecurity breaches. Well, allegedly, but we'll just say that for simplicity's sake that that's true. A decentralized service that can offer something that's truly groundbreaking has to solve for the decentralized risk. A very simple example, which we detail in a paper called This is Fine, Optimism and Emergency in a Peer-to-Peer Network, is the historical example of the copyright wars, right? The idea of the attempt by copyright reformists to completely recondition or reconfigure the idea of intellectual property rights, and how by using a decentralized system, they were able to do that quite successfully. But the flip side was that the legal risk that challenging a centralized intellectual property model entailed was then, basically targeted by those who were under attack. So those centralized systems went after individual users in the decentralized system and successfully sued large numbers of people who are participating in those systems. And so I think where the breakthrough in digital identity will come from, especially in these concepts that we're talking, is that solve for those two issues, consent and decentralization of risk.
We have 1 minute left, so we're going to go with a lightning round. I'm an incrementalist. You guys have talked about a lot of big picture ideas. 20 seconds each. One small but powerful building block that would get us incrementally closer to secure private digital identity. Micha, we'll start with you, and Jen will give you the last word. So we'll go Micha, Cade, Jen.
Well, I think there's a very simple way things could be implemented that doesn't require actually much technology, where instead of when you enter into a service have opted in automatically for everything and you have to opt out basically. And I can see that there's a trend now for actually pushing the users to opt in. And I think if we ask each time you share information to opt in, that's already a big progress. Yeah.
Cade.
Evaluating identity not from a device-to-device perspective, but from the relationships perspective.
Excellent. Jen, 8 seconds.
By the end of the pandemic, everybody has a digital wallet that can control and manage their health data.
Look at that. Right under the wire. Well done. We got our 3 questions in each. Thank you very much, everybody. That was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here I am. Thank you, Derek.
Well, now we know how Ryan gets so much done at Messari. Clearly, that's how he pushes his employees. He's just like, okay, we got 8 seconds. Let's do this. Thanks so much. That was an incredible session. Cade, Jen, Micha, thanks so much. Ryan, thanks for moderating. That was absolutely incredible. We're going to go back to some information we talked about yesterday. In case you missed it, we are using proof of attendance protocol to distribute this gorgeous badge that you can use to prove that you were here watching Priv8 live with thousands of other people. To claim it, all you need to do is visit orchid.com/PRIV8 POAP, Private POAP, short for proof of attendance protocol. And fill out a quick form. It's hosted by Airtable. We need this because we need to share a unique link with each individual person who wants to claim the badge. So fill it out. Starting tomorrow, we will start distributing these customized links for each individual person who comes to claim one of the Private POAP badges. And yeah, it's free to mint on the XDAI blockchain. So when you get your link and you go to claim your badge, just choose that option if you want, and you can mint for free instead of paying $10 or $15 worth of gas on Ethereum right now. For anybody who's worried, we're not going to keep your email address on file. We're not going to subscribe you to the newsletter. Even this data will be deleted right after Priv8 is over, and we've sent everyone their unique URL to claim the badge. That being said, I am incredibly happy to have Chad Soren Harper join us now for a unique opportunity to talk about something he's just designed, not only this badge, but also 2 gorgeous pieces of art that Chad has designed exclusively for Priv8. We're going to be putting these up for auction soon. Chad, can you tell us a little bit about your thought process that went into these amazing looking NFTs?
Oh, thanks, Derek. I appreciate that. Yeah, so the NFT seemed like a fun opportunity to really sort of, have some fun with Orchid's visual branding elements, namely Paula, who is our intrepid bunny mascot there. Name Paula coming from one of our engineers, Greg Hazel. That's his sort of story to tell. But yeah, the general thinking behind the NFT art was, what if Paula was at the front lines of the privacy war, and sort of what that would look like, and what if the privacy war came to sort of Orchid's idyllic world of floating islands and and all of her sort of cyberpunk superhero glory. So
Nice.
yeah.
Yeah, so what we're doing here, we're just about to drop the links in the Brella chat, YouTube. We will tweet and Facebook and Instagram and Reddit and Telegram, all of this. We're going to drop these links to everybody. The purple version on what I believe is your left, it's on my left. It's going to include a physical print for whoever wins this auction and a lifetime Orchid account. There's going to be a ton of money in there. It should last you an incredibly long time, but basically lifetime access to Orchid VPN. And then the green variant, there's 6. So in total, there's 7. Haha. It's there's 6 editions of that, and it's just the digital file itself. No, I shouldn't say just. It is an incredible piece of work, but there's no physical print. There's no lifetime Orchid account. It's the image itself. The proceeds for this are going to go to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Freedom of the Press, Freedom House, and Coin Center, nonprofit organizations who obviously believe in a lot of the same things that Orchid does as an organization, and are just like Orchid is positioning itself, I think, very much at the front lines of trying to ensure we keep the privacy rights that we have right now and potentially reclaim any that we've lost over the last, certainly over the last year, depending on where you live, and perhaps more going further back. So yeah, the links are dropping. If you don't see it where you are, check the Twitter account, check the Facebook, check the YouTube chat. We're going to share these as widely as possible. Auctions start now and will be ending Monday morning, March 29th, 10 a.m. Eastern, 1400 UTC if you prefer. And yeah, that's what we're doing here. Chad, thanks so much for spending some time this afternoon with us.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Terrific. Great. I'm going to pass things off now to Kara Swisher for an incredibly special conversation with Audrey Tang.
Hi, everybody. This is Kara Swisher. I'm here with Audrey Tang, and we're going to talk a lot about privacy. All this privacy stuff was great. I'm not actually Kara Swisher. I've forgotten what it's like to be at a great privacy conference, because they usually just try to steal all your information. So that's a pleasure. So let's actually get into that, because, Audrey, we talked about 6 months ago, I think, right in the middle of it. And Taiwan still has managed to really excel at what's happening with the pandemic and the response to it. I just want to sort of get an update from when we spoke before, because you were talking about all these different methodologies you were using. So I'd love you to sort of talk to me about what has worked and what hasn't worked to begin with, especially around privacy and also the protection of public health, which are sometimes at cross purposes.
Yeah, nothing much have changed, which I guess is good news, right? We're still at around 10 COVID-related deaths. There's basically no lockdowns for the entire COVID-19 period, and we countered the pandemic with no lockdown specifically because we made sure that everybody understood the basic public health measures, including physical distancing and access to the PPEs, especially masks. We, I think, talk a little bit about how the open source applications, hundreds of them, help people locating the mask availability. And now we're moving, beyond just having masks available. People are now wearing masks as fashion items, I guess. But then we're still keeping the basic reproduction value of both the virus and also the infodemic and conspiracy theories at firmly below 1. And so we're largely post-pandemic. That hasn't changed.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the privacy implications and some of the things you were doing. It wasn't, even in lots of countries, including the United States, that was difficult. And it wasn't over privacy issues. It was, I don't know quite what it was over, the lack of use of masks or just chuckleheadness is what we call it in this country. But talk a little bit about the issues around privacy, how you dealt with them, because I think one of the things that's been remarkable is this idea of, as I said, sometimes public health and privacy feel like they're at cross purposes. So can you sort of walk us through that?
Sure. So we use what we call a participatory self-surveillance in terms of re-decentralizing, for example, the contact system for a local outbreak to be monitored. Of course, you have to go back and look at who frequented that particular place in the past 14 days. But if we centralize all the records, that not only centralize the risk, but also makes the people who in their lines of work want to protect privacy, for example, people who are hosts or hostesses in the hostess bars in the nightlife district. They are the people that really would like to protect the identity anonymity of their patrons. And so we actually did have a case last April when a hostess in a hostess bar initially didn't admit that she worked in that profession until the next day, where she said, I have to protect my clients and so on. But instead of putting the nightlife district to jail or fining them for not collaboration with the CECC, the Central African Command Center, we instead said that how about we co-create it from the first principles so that people can use throwaway SIM cards or Proton mail accounts and so on, and leave a contact without leaving a name on literally scratch pads when entering such businesses, so that after 4 weeks with no local outbreak, they can literally shred it, and at no time do those information need to be aggregated or collected to the Central Epidemic Command Center, unless, of course, an outbreak happens. And that enabled the nightlife districts to essentially reopen in May, and that enabled Taiwan to avoid the situation in other jurisdictions where those, like the U.S. prohibition era, right? This business as driven underground became the hazards to the pandemic.
So talk about this self-surveillance, this concept. I think it's, the word surveillance terrifies a lot of people in privacy. And in general, it's sort of a malevolent word or used malevolently. So explain to the concept of self-surveillance.
Sure. So there's this term called surveillance, I think, Steve Mann term, that talks about how ordinary citizens armed with wearable cams, right, which was very fashionable when Steve Mann first started wearing it, but now everybody has a phone, and who could actually provide the kind of information that's needed to keep, for example, the public institutions accountable, or to, in our case, to make sure that the contact tracing still works. But because this surveillance is not a oversight, is a undersight in the term that people participating in it understand exactly what they're doing, and the incentives are aligned so that the people who visit the nightlife district, the businesses and the workers there are both aligned in their incentive in keeping each other healthy, but not revealing each other's full identity to the wider community. And so this kind of surveillance in a participatory fashion enables the kind of public health measures that could go to the places where traditional top-down measures could not.
So talk about that idea of top-down measures, because the idea of doing it yourself has not caught on elsewhere, or it has caught on in some places. So what does it take to create a feeling where you're self-surveilling and having your privacy protected at the same time?
I think one of the main things is that there needs to be a comprehensive communication platform or mimetic engineering that talks about the rational self-interest of participating in such measures. For example, when we talk about wearing masks, we didn't say wear it to protect the elderly. We didn't say wear it to respect the frontline health workers, which are all true, but it doesn't appeal to rational self-interest. Rather, we say wear a mask to protect your own face against your own unwashed hands. And this not only links hand sanitation with mask use, but it actually is a viral meme that actually spreads because people are interested in protecting themselves against their own unwashed hands. And so that makes sure that everybody could share this message, remix this message, and so it becomes truly grassroots.
So the grassroots, in that you're saying this is about you, this is about selfishness, like you're going to protect your. One of the things you said when we talked before was when people here, where was it here? I have to find it. There was a really good quote. The best ideas are the ones that take in most people's feelings, and then we turn that into a regulation.
That's right. Yes. So it's by responding to what people feel as important in the here and now, by responding in something that everyone can use. So that's empowerment, right? Because they can turn the technology, in this case, mask and soap are useful chemical and physical vaccine technologies, and repurpose this communication in a way that their community understands and mask dispense, for example, is run by the community pharmacists who already have the trust of the local elderly people, so that the people do not have to learn another like digital apparatus or to download this NFC-enabled app or anything like that. They can continue to do whatever they were already doing, interacting with the people they already trust, just with this extra communication about public health.
Is there something different about the people of Taiwan as opposed to anywhere else where this didn't work? With this, or it wasn't tried, I guess, is the point you're making.
Well, yeah, everyone above 30 years old in Taiwan remember how badly we managed SARS in 2003, which COVID is technically, SARS-CoV-2, so SARS 2.0, right? So when SARS 1.0 hit Taiwan in 2003, we had exactly the same chaotic communications. People were panic buying all sorts of different things. We had to lock down an entire hospital unannounced. It was very, very chaotic. So I think the main difference is just that in 2004, we learned from that memory when the trauma was still fresh and institutionalized the kind of response that I was just sharing into not just our laws, but also our like yearly drills and so on.
And you called it that your model of government tech, at least, is founded on radical trust and transparency from the government to the people.
Yeah, it's about trusting the people from the government. The people may not trust the government. Maybe that's the better. But the Korea Public Service really need to trust the citizens.
And don't is your feeling, or that you? What do you mean by that? The citizens have to trust the government, or the government?
No, the government need to trust the citizens in the sense of trusting that the participatory measures are going to be carried out by people who care about their own health and other neighbors' health, right? About trusting the citizens to use this real-time open data, open API of mask availability for good and not for abuse, right? And trusting the citizens to come up with social innovations, for example, about using traditional rice cookers to kill the virus and not kill the mask, which is essentially outside of its design purpose, but it's appropriate for the day, right? And so all these is about social innovation that's initiated by the social sector. And this is what I mean by trusting the citizen to come up with the measures. And if you impose the top-down measures like lockdown and so on, then of course it decimates, like literally cut by 10% people's free agencies for each measure.
So cutting their free agency in that it's been top down and they just are told what to do and therefore resist it.
Exactly.
All right. So talk a little bit of the specifics of some of the things that you think worked better and stuff that didn't work as well. So you had the hotel stays. That again was an area where privacy was a big issue and what people were doing. Talk a little bit about how you initiated that and what you think you changed and did better over time, or what didn't work initially.
Sure. There's a heuristic that we do not invent new data collection points during the pandemic. This is both out of necessity of the legal arrangement, because we never declare a state of emergency. So everything we do must be pre-approved by the legislature. And also because people understand the cybersecurity and privacy parameters of existing measures more, right? So it's less likely to result into abuse if we reuse existing data collection points. So for example,
this is the concept of don't take, there's an expression in the United States, there's not, crisis is always an opportunity. In this case, it's not a data opportunity.
No, it's not, because when you develop a greenfield code from scratch, it's very unlikely that you will understand the full cybersecurity and privacy implications, even for the best teams, and especially coding under pressure. But if we say, hey, when you're returning to Taiwan, you have to stay in your own residence or in a quarantine hotel for 14 days, and we're not going to ask you to install an app, but your SIM card, your phone number will be tagged in the telecoms, and they're not going to send it to third-party processors. They're going to use exactly the same mechanism that they notify you in advance of the earthquakes or the flood evacuation warnings and so on, based on triangulation. So it doesn't know which room you're in. It can't interface with your email or WhatsApp, but it does know to roughly 50-meter radius that you're breaking out of the quarantine, in which an automatic SMS is first sent to your phone and then to the local health officers, offices. And if they check on you and you're not there, then SMS is sent to the police officers. But that is applied with equity, and everybody understands that basically it all gets deleted after 4 weeks. The whole point is that if people understand what's already going on, then the privacy boundaries and measures are upheld by the people because everybody feels it's proportional. But if it's new code, whether it's proportional or not is a matter of great debate.
Meaning that it doesn't get to certain people are affected and others are not.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that in terms of any mistakes you made in doing that, was there something that you had to correct? Was there something that didn't work?
Yeah, a simple thing is that in the very beginning, like early February last year, we had to basically improvise a lot of ways to ramp up our mask production. In a country of 23 million, we originally had less than 2 million a day production for medical grade mask. We eventually improved the production to more than 20 million a day, but it takes time, right? So for a couple of days, the CECC was saying, maybe for healthy people in public transportation that's well ventilated, maybe you don't have to wear the mask all the time. And we faced such a backlash. People were saying, it's the state's duty to make the mask that people need. So we really had to do a U-turn around 48 hours afterwards. Of course, I guess other jurisdictions did a U-turn 48 days afterward or many months afterwards. But I think that's a mistake in the very early days. And after that, when we rolled out the mask availability map, there was also a data quality or rather data bias issue in that because we publish the numbers of every 30 seconds the people's purchase. And we were initially quite happy because the pharmacies locations almost overlap exactly with the population centers. So we felt that every individual in Taiwan are roughly the same distance away from the pharmacy loaded with medical grade mask. And so in a kind of Taipei-based viewpoint, this is fair, right? But just after a couple of weeks, a MP from an opposition party, the Taiwan People's Party MP Gao Hong'an, she is the VP of Data Analytics in Foxconn before joining the parliament, so she knows something about data, and she analyzed it with the OpenStreetMap community, saying it's actually not true because while it's the same distance by helicopter, if people are in rural areas and had to take public transportation, maybe by the time they reach the pharmacy has already closed. So the time opportunity cost is not the same. There is bias in this data, and because it's evidence-based interpolation, Minister Chen of CECC didn't defend the policy. He just said, legislator teach us. And then we start co-creating, and just 24 hours afterward, we change the distribution mechanism, and we also introduce pre-ordering to the convenience store that open 24 hours a day.
And then keeping health records of people and how they do it is obviously important because when we look back on this, it's going to be critically important. Talk a little bit about what privacy protections you wanted to put in there, because I know a lot of people who don't want people to know they had COVID, or know they got a vaccine. It's a lot of secretiveness attached to it, and I'm not sure what that is at this moment here in this country, at least. But how do you deal with those issues?
Well, the main thing is that the national healthcare system, which is universal healthcare, which covers not just citizens, but also residents and everyone who use the gold card to enter Taiwan also enjoy the healthcare. We made sure that by law, this IC card only stores your data in a way that's disaggregated with pretty much anything else. It could only be used in medical services and other public services that's pre-registered with the National Health Insurance Agency, and it's never interfacing any other entities in the economic sector or other sectors. And so because of that, people could rest assured that every transaction that they do with this universal health card is recorded as true, it's centralized as true, but it's not connected to the wider internet, and it's not going to be used in anything that's not a designated purpose public service. And everybody can also keep that to account by downloading the NHI app. There's more than 5 million people downloading that in the last year. They used it not only to pre-order masks or dedicate their mask rations to international humanitarian aid, but also to check all their visits to their dentists, to their doctors, downloading X-ray scans. I think even CT scans could be downloaded and analyzed locally on the phone. And so they participate in this data collaborative, that they are the active participant who not can only choose what to participate in, for example, the mass donation stuff, but also to correct the data pertaining to them if the data are wrong. So this is about the participatory auditing and control.
And talk a little bit about targeting of people to get them to do things. One of the things that you said to me last time we talked was two things. The more trust you place in the citizens, the more trustworthy they become. And instead of asking people to come to technology, bring technology to where people are. Talk about the idea of trust, because I think one of the issues around privacy is the lack of trust, that you're saying these things, but it's not what actually happens, or things leak, or whether they're by hacking or just by accident or malevolence or just trying to do a better business.
Yeah, I think the main thing about getting trust is to admit failures or U-turns, or saying legislator teach us when a mistake or bias has been pointed out early on. If we let it linger, or if we respond only after a quarter or two, or if we respond by saying, this is an emergency response when the pandemic is over, then of course that's over. We don't earn any trust this way. So I think a lot of it is about a timely response in the here and now. In the last year alone, there's more than 2 million phone calls called to the hotline, the toll-free number 1922, where everyone can get their privacy questions answered in the call center, and even unrelated questions that call center cannot handle. For example, last April, there was a young boy who called saying, "You're rationale mask, but why am I only getting the pink ones? All the boys in my class got navy blue ones, and I don't want to wear pink to school. I'm a boy." And then just 24 hours afterwards, everybody in the CECC wore pink, and then pink became the most trendy color for quite a while. And so this kind of rapid response, this agile methodology, makes sure that we continuously integrate people's feedback. I think that garners trust.
When you think about this, part of the mistrust has to do with polarization and misinformation. And it's another thing that you tried to deal with, because it creates a feeling of that this information is not being used correctly, or going to other information that may seem more trustworthy to you in some way, or that you are being watched. I mean, it works rather well in this country that if they know what you're doing, or, right now the rumor around vaccines is that Bill Gates is putting a chip in your vaccine and therefore it's going to track you. I asked him, he said that is not the case.
Like 5G antenna as part of the mask or something. I've read this.
So talk to me how you deal with that, because there are, generalized feelings about privacy and surveillance that are still, it's not the worst thing to be worried about, but it can turn very ugly and get in the way of vaccines or mask wearing or other things like that.
Yeah, I think one of the main thing about the disinformation or infodemic, as I prefer to call it, is that it's really a symptom, and the root cause is sometimes that the participatory nature of getting the truth, figuring it out together. I'll just call it journalism, because in Taiwan, news work and journalism is the same Mandarin word. So if everyone think about how can we contribute to the common sensing of what's really happening, if people feel that they are empowered, for example, during our election, during the counting process, everyone is invited, even YouTubers and so on, to film the entire paper-based counting process. So even if people distrust the opposition party and only trust their party's YouTubers are armed with not just a mobile phone with camera, but also with an app, a custom app that can count the tallying in real time and synchronize that with the video footage. So if the three different political parties, YouTubers agree on the counts, then there's really not much room for the conspiracy theory about the election process to go viral. But if people do not feel that they can actually go in and cover this whole thing, if this magic box is doing all the counting and so on, then of course that is the root cause, and the disinformation we see is mostly just a symptom.
Well, sometimes they just don't believe it, and even if you give them deep proof of things, correct?
Yeah, surely. But just like the herd immunity, getting enough amounts of people in the population to participate in just a little bit of fact checking, just a little bit of news work, builds, I guess, nerd immunity in that even if a certain individual believes a certain thing and shared, it's less likely that other people who have participated in the fact finding will reshare that piece of conspiracy theory. And as long as the R value is under 1, it will not go viral.
Right. So you're talking about the R value, which is a virus value too. When you are thinking of this, then what are some of the surveillance and privacy worries that you had to push back? What were the most difficult ones? I think in this, depends on the group in the United States and other places, but some cases they've had bad experiences with vaccine. In other cases, there's a whole thing around stem cells, religious people thinking it was, stem cells were used in these things. There's all kinds of things. Other people don't want to be tracked by Bill Gates and his mythical chip that he puts in the vaccine. So what are some of the more outlandish ones, and how did you deal with them there in Taiwan? Or maybe you didn't have them because you're better people.
We didn't have that with vaccines or masks. We did have a conspiracy theory that says the state is confiscating all the tissue paper material to make masks. So we're run out of tissue paper, soon go out and buy. And people really did go out and buy, and there's no tissue papers for a morning or two. But it was countered by this very funny meme that's rolled out by our premier's office, with our premier wiggling his bum and saying very large font, each of us only have a pair of Botox. And is it wordplay? Because in Mandarin, to stockpile tun sounds exactly the same as bottom tun. And so basically he's saying we can't use that many anyway. And that went viral. And with that, a very clear table saying the tissue papers are made out of South American materials, and the medical grade masks are actually plastic product. They're made out of domestic material. So there's no way that making the mask to 20 million a day will hurt any of the production lines of the tissue papers. And just after a couple of days, the rumor died down.
So was there anything that you dealt with that you were worried about on people's privacy? One of the things I'm thinking about right now is this it's starting to be somewhat of a controversy, is this vaccine passport idea, that you have proof of vaccine, that this is a surveillance problem, and that some people get to participate and some don't if they don't have the vaccine. You talk about, you've moved into the vaccine phase. Is that something that you all think about, and how you would roll that out?
Well, we had a lot of vaccines, the flu vaccines and so on. The availability of the vaccine shots and so on are already tracked in an interactive map. And so we just change a few parameters, and now you can check the COVID-19 vaccine places. It's exactly the same system. Again, we don't invent new data collection or use points. We just treat it exactly as any other vaccination process. And your vaccination record is in the NHI app. You can, of course, download the NHI app and look at all your visits to vaccination exactly as any other vaccines. But people are opting in. I mean, we're not really in a rush because we've got plenty of physical vaccine, that's the mask, and our value is still very much below 1, and we don't have any local confirmed cases for quite a while now. And so people are just taking their time. But for the frontline health workers and later on for the diplomats, I guess, people who are going to the Tokyo Olympic, of course, they're going to get vaccines.
What is the vaccine uptake in the country right now?
It's just started. So we did not, at the moment, have more than the doses required for the medical workers, the frontline workers. I think it will be another couple months before our locally, domestically produced vaccine get the EUA, at which time, of course, we'll have plenty of vaccine and also to help other countries.
So one of the things you also told me was, we just have a few more minutes, but internet affordability is considered a healthcare right, like healthcare a right.
Oh, yeah.
Is privacy that same thing? Is it a right among your citizens? How do you, because there is some bit of watching and monitoring them, and you're trying to get their cooperation. But do you
Mhm.
feel like it's also a right of people to
Oh, yeah,
have?
definitely. Definitely. I think privacy is not just a core human right, but I would also like to say that the digital spaces need to respect the same kind of norms that we come to expect in the analog places. That is to say, the expected norms need not to be disrupted, quote unquote, just because you're in part of a digital public infrastructure as opposed to an analog public infrastructure. So a digital town hall, for example, carries the same privacy expectations to an analog town hall. The same would apply to universities, learning places, national parks, and things like that. And if we ask people to change their norm expectations drastically, I think it's not just a human right problem, but it's also a governance problem.
Meaning?
Meaning that if people behave expecting that there's certain privacy guarantees because they are acting, for example, in the national e-petition platform, we make sure that people could post pseudonymously. So people feel safe and they could post some whistleblowing stuff, and people who are not 18 years old still enjoy the full citizens initiative rights and so on. But if we disrupt that guarantee and reveal their real identity to their employers, to the schools, and so on, just because it's digital, and we could trick them into revealing their organizations or whatever, then we're violating that guarantee. So it's not just about being legal or not. It's about people behaving in a digital public infrastructure in a way that people come to feel as a safe space, and therefore contributing whatever their real experiences is to the public decision making.
Are there any differences, though? There are differences between a digital and a public space. I mean, an analog public space.
Well, there's, I think, two main differences. The main thing about the digital space is that because in Mandarin, digital sounds the same as plural, 数位, right? So the digital minister is plural minister. So it means that each appearance could be remixed theoretically. It could, if you speak here in this private conference, it could be actually be screen captured and remixed and used in another place, right? And this place may respect all your norms, but that remix place may violate the norms. So the downstream wise, a norm that propagates to the remixes and reuses, that's going to be very important. That's the first one. And the second one, of course, there are the ways of impersonation of getting identity of other people through cybersecurity means. That's simply not possible thanks to a law of physics in the analog space.
So what are your greatest worries around privacy after having this experience? Also, what do you think the most important things to take away for you? We just said about 2 minutes. And what are your greatest worries going into? Because, in all, looking at it overall, it's a huge success. You've had a huge success that was not replicated in other places. So when you're thinking about that, what do you think? What are your greatest worries or things you think are important for people to keep in mind, especially around when it comes to privacy?
Yeah, I think my main worry is that other jurisdictions in the world, maybe not learning about Taiwan's model, will falsely think that the top-down, lockdown, shutdown, takedown is the only way to counter a pandemic or an infodemic. And my main worry is that like political capitalism, both the surveillance state and the surveillance capitalists will see this as the golden opportunity to encroach on the civil liberties and build a new norm that forces people to accept to the sacrifice of their privacies and their self-agency. And so the reason why we're sharing this Taiwan model so much is not just because it's a great thing public health and economy-wise, but also it deepens democracy and privacy and civil rights even during the pandemic. Actually, because of that, we counter a pandemic better.
And when you look around the world where people were you worried about some efforts that were made that were successful that did violate privacy issues? Was that a worry of yours? Because there were lots of ways to control a population.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, Dr. Li Wenliang, the original whistleblower from Wuhan PRC, did save the Taiwanese people because his message that, and I quote, "there's 7 new SARS cases in the Huanan seafood market," end of quote, did make rounds to PTT, the Taiwanese digital public infrastructure subsidized by the National Taiwan University with no advertisers or shareholders, and people triaged that. And that ended up resulting in, just after 24 hours, with Star Health inspection for all 5 passengers coming in from Wuhan. But the same message did not reach the Wuhan people, and because of their harmonization, right, things. And that, of course, could have actually saved people in Wuhan. And maybe it did reach the other social medias in the world, but maybe because there's more noise than signals, maybe it's like, not public but private infrastructure, like a nightclub with very loud music. You have to shout to get heard, people serving toxic drinks, and with private bouncer and so on. So it really did not reach the kind of rough consensus that the Taiwan people reached around the same message. So getting that kind of message spread and into the radar of everyone and building an actionable rough consensus, I think that's the main thing we all need to do after this particular pandemic.
Well, that's a great end, rough consensus. That's a great way to put it. Thank you, Audrey. Really appreciate it, Minister Tang, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.
Thank you. Thank you, Spock. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. Thank you, Kara, for your time today. This was incredible. Yeah, I don't really know how else to sum it up. Lots of lessons I think we can learn from how to treat citizens' data or residents' data properly in a disaggregated format, as Audrey was saying. So this ends another fantastic day here at Orchid Private. Tune in tomorrow. We have a conversation with Ken Liu. We have more NFTs. We'll talk about those again, and lots of other things happening on our last day of Private 2021. For now, stay free.